Okay, so as I mentioned before, today is election day in my home state of Virginia. I need to get my act together and go vote at some point today. And this is big news. Our friend Kyle Kondik over at Larry Sabato's Crystal Ball, they did their final analysis of this race. Let's go ahead and throw that tear sheet up on the screen. And in it, they have long had this race as lean Democrat. They have moved on election eve the race to lean Republican. Wow. They think that the metrics they're seeing slightly favor Glenn Youngkin. Let me read a little bit of what they say here. Let's assume the bulk of the polls are correct and that the race ends up being very close either way. Both of those possible results, a narrow win by either candidate, would suggest a significant fall off for Democrats from their strong Virginia performances in the Trump era and represent at the very least a bright red check engine light at the midpoint of the Democrats' journey from last year's presidential race to next year's midterm. I think another really important thing that Kyle goes through here, listen, if you're not in Virginia, why should you care about Virginia? Well, if you look at recent history in particular, Virginia actually has been quite a good bellwether for which direction the national winds are blowing. It hasn't always been that way because politics used to be a little bit more localized. Now, what happens at the state level is pretty reflective of the mood of the country, who's energized, who's depressed, and the sort of state of, the national politics writ large. He writes, in summary, 3 of the last 4 Virginia elections did end up being bellwethers for the future. Perhaps the surprising closeness of McAuliffe's 2013 victory also ended up being something of a harbinger for 2014 as well. The Virginia results from the recent, more distant past are more mixed. But what we've seen is after Obama, Bob McDonnell, Republican, gets elected pretty strongly too, and that portends the Tea Party wave. And you've seen in every election since then the way that the Virginia results effectively foreshadow what's coming for you at the national level. So what they're saying here is, number one, they think ever so slightly the polls and the metrics favor Youngkin. He seems to really have the momentum going into Election Day. This is the polar opposite of what happened in California, whereas things got more real.
That's exactly it.
Voters said, oh my God, I got to go out and vote for Gavin Newsom. Here, Youngkin seems to be on the march, and the polls have continued to tighten and actually show him up. Here's the very last 538 average of polls. And it has the race very close.
1 point.
But with Youngkin up by 1 point. We can throw that graphic up on the screen. You can see McAuliffe led almost the entire time up to the very end. And now you have seen Youngkin surge. Of course, we had that Fox News poll that was definitely an outlier that had Youngkin up by 8. That would certainly be affecting those averages. But you can see just how close this thing ultimately is.
It really is amazing in the closing days of what's happening here with the 1 point increase on Youngkin. And, there's been, look, everybody got burned by polls back in 2020, but one of the important things that we would try to emphasize is that whenever it shows tight races for Democrats or leading Republicans, I tend to believe it a little bit more. And that's not wishful thinking. It's given the fact that throughout the last 5 years, we have seen a consistent undercounting of Republican support in the Trump era. Now, this is going to be the very first test. Without Trump on the ballot and in national politics, is the Trump effect on polls going to hold? I'm going to say probably yes, given the way that so much of the coalitions have shifted. To that Bob McDonnell point, he won Fairfax County last time whenever he became the governor of the state of Virginia. This time, per Dave Wasserman over the Cook Political Report, Youngkin could lose that by 35 points and still win the governor's race because the coalition of the voters has completely shifted in who exactly is going to be voting for the Republican Party. And that shift, which happened so dramatically in the last 10 years, has just not yet accounted in a lot of these polls. So when you see Youngkin up by 1, if you consider Trump logic, he could be up by 5. I mean, it's actually not outside the realm of possibility that he wins by 8 points. Now, it would be pretty crazy if that happened. At the same time, he could also lose by 2 or 3. And that would tell us that we've actually seen almost like an Obama reversion to the mean of 2012. So this is a big test for polling and the state of that as well. But, finally, it all just comes down to, what is this all about? Believe the candidates when they say what they're actually putting their money towards, what they want voters to hear. For Terry McAuliffe, it's one thing. Glenn Youngkin is tied to Donald Trump. And Virginia, we hate Trump. Remember? Here's his closing ad. Let's take a listen.
How did we end up here? The lies, the division. It starts when we give room for hate to grow.
You also had very fine people on both sides.
And for some, they embrace it.
I was honored to receive President Trump's endorsement.
But leadership requires taking a stand.
I have a message to all the white supremacists and the Nazis who came into Charlottesville today. Go home. You are not wanted in this great Commonwealth.
And not giving oxygen to the lies.
The single biggest issue
The most important issue
is talking about the election fraud.
So let's just audit the voting machines.
This election is about lifting up all Virginians and protecting our democracy. What we stand for and what kind of Commonwealth our kids will inherit. Let's choose a better way.
I'm Terry McAuliffe, candidate for governor, and I sponsored this ad.
Trump, 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 Trump,
All
Trump,
about
Trump, Trump.
Charlottesville, January
Charlottesville was 5 years ago,
6th.
just so you know.
Yeah, well, and also, I mean, it's just what's depressing. There's a lot depressing, but what was depressing about his message, and I'm about to show you Youngkin's message as well. Neither one of them mentions a single policy issue. Not one.
In the state, even like a state issue.
Nothing. Nothing about what they would do for voters. It's just, this guy's bad and I'm good.
Yep.
Youngkin, in an attempt, I think, to sort of refute the ties to Trump and the insinuation that he's racist and xenophobic and all of this, his is, showcasing the diversity of Virginia. Lots of people from all different backgrounds sort of featured in this ad of Youngkin looking like the nice, suburban dad that he's portrayed himself as in this campaign. Let's take a look at that.
We have been traveling all over this Commonwealth of Virginia. And I'll tell you, it has been amazing what's happening everywhere we go. Because crowds are like this everywhere we go. So we're in this bus, and we're asking everybody to sign the bus. So when we're done tonight, please go outside, get a pen, we got these cool pens, and sign the bus. What that allows us to do is allows us to have thousands of Virginians with us everywhere we go. Everywhere we go. Sign the bus. Now, friends, the reason why that's important is because everywhere we go, we're standing up for Virginians. This is no longer a campaign. This is a movement.
Very different messages. Neither of them really having to do with the state of Virginia.
Not
but
a thing.
That's politics now. It is all national, completely nationalized. I'm going to be talking about some of that in my radar as well, about what exactly people are discussing, whether COVID even impacts the elections anymore and to what extent. But it is just fascinating watching this happen because, look, if Youngkin wins by a couple of points, let's say a relatively decisive margin for a blue state, like a 3 or 4 points, the Dems are so screwed in the upcoming midterms elections. It's like difficult to even describe.
They're already so screwed.
I think you're right.
And this
I
is
think
the
you're
point
right.
Kyle kind of keeps making, which is like, let's say Terry McAuliffe pulls it off in a squeaker.
Like a half point or something.
It's still a disaster.
Right.
Total
Still a
disaster.
10-point loss, right.
I mean, this has Scott Brown vibes written all over it. And that was Massachusetts. I mean, this is Virginia. It's not as blue as Massachusetts. But at this point, this should be like a 10-point Dem win. And, let's give the caveats. They do have history going against them. Oftentimes there's a swing back to, a reversion, back to the mean, all of those things. But, Dems really kind of felt like they had the suburbs locked up. Like this was done. There had been a realignment.
And it was
this
over.
Suburban, these ex-urban voters were in their camp now, and that was that. And I think we already know, dramatically overestimated how much of their support was actually about them and how much of it was just solely opposition to Trump. So we're going to get a good look tonight at just how badly they miscalculated. And look, you never know. Maybe Terry McAuliffe, maybe the polls are wrong in his direction. Gavin Newsom's polling was understated. Anything could possibly happen, and maybe he wins by a more comfortable margin and they breathe a little easier tomorrow. But going into this thing, doesn't look good.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't.
Hey guys, thanks so much for watching.
That's right. Just as a reminder, you can become a premium subscriber today. Watch the full show completely uncut, our reactions to each other's monologues. You get to listen to it. You get to ask us questions, all that good stuff. Link is right there in the description or at breakingpoints.com.
Best of all, great way to say screw you to the mainstream media.